Hey guys, it's Jake here with eTrailer. Today we've got a 2023 Grand Design Solitude fifth wheel, and we're going to be taking a look at, and I'm going to show you how to install the Roadmaster Comfort Ride Slipper Spring System. The Comfort Ride system is designed to replace your entire factory suspension on your fifth wheel camper. And you may be wondering, why would something this big be a necessary replacement? Well, a lot of the times from the factory, the manufacturers are putting the leaf spring setup underneath the camper with the Equalizer in there without anything on it. And then they decide to throw different year make models on top of that same frame. Sometimes they are, the springs and whole suspension setup is overloaded. With this particular setup, it's very, very heavy, and they were having issues with a very uncomfortable ride. The way that the equalizers work is great because it transfers the energy from a bump that was hit with the first axle, sends it into the second. But a lot of times if that bump was heavy enough, it'll send it into the second, then the second will send it back into the first axle. So you can see where that problem would keep reoccurring. A lot of times you get those issues going onto a highway when you get a lot of the cracks in the concrete, picking up speed. That's called chucking, and you can solve a lot of that with this slipper spring system. The way that this slipper style system is going to work is that the front and rear axles are now going to be independent. So when you hit a bump with the first, it's going to be absorbed into the shock system that's built into this, this whole setup. And then when the back axle hits it, it's going to hit and not affect the front axle. That is what's going to make this so much more comfortable, is that slipper spring style. The slipper spring style is actually an older style of leaf spring, which a lot of manufacturers don't use it anymore because they like to use the double eye leaf spring. The double eye is still a very good system, but when you get into something this heavy, you really need to have independent suspension. But the shock kit is what's going to help to tame down those the leaf springs when you're going down the road. If you hit a bump, the leaf spring will absorb the energy and hold the weight of the trailer, but the shock will control it. You think of it just as if you had a vehicle. Every vehicle out there is going to have a spring and a shock. Well, that just goes to show you that trailers should also have them. If you've ever seen a vehicle bouncing down the road and it just keeps bouncing, or if you've had that personally happen to your vehicle, that is because the shock is no longer working, and the spring will just continue to allow it to bounce, because that's what springs are designed to do. The shock will help to control the bouncing of your rig. There are different weight capacities available for this particular kit, so if you have this same model but maybe it weighs a little bit more, you will want to look into that. You want to basically look at what your factory setup is and what your axles are rated for and match the kit to that. Now, I've pulled a fifth wheel for quite a few years now, about 7 years that I've had mine. And what I noticed when going over our test course with the factory system on this is exactly what I had assumed it would feel like. And that is, it's going to get that you have that constant body roll back and forth. And when you hit a bump, you can feel it in the first one and it transfers to the back. You can kind of feel that. And then when the back axle hits it, it transfers to the front and you can feel that. So you're almost feeling every bump twice every time you hit it. With this system, I noticed that once you hit the bumps, the first axle takes it and the shocks settle it down. Then the second axle hits it and the shocks will help to settle it down. So it just rides so much more smoothly through our parking lot, running over our bumps course. One thing I do want to point out with this particular camper is that it actually came in to get this system because he almost had to. He actually broke a hanger off the back because he hit a bump pretty hard, and that front axle transferred it so hard into the back that it bent or broke that back hanger. You'll see it later on in the installation that the hanger's brand new, and we'd hate to have you guys have to beef up your hangers or anything like that just to get a smoother ride out of your rig. This is what our system's going to look like when it's installed. You can obviously see it's much, much bulkier, much heavier than the factory system that's currently on your RV or your camper. You'll also see that we now have a slipper design, which is going to help with the travel. Your traditional style suspension is going to have an equalizer in the middle, which basically what that's designed to do is it's going to take the energy from the first axle, send it into the second one. The second one pushes harder against the ground, and then it evens out or equalizes the pressure to make it a much smoother ride. Well, a lot of times what can happen is if you're hitting pretty hard bumps it just keeps transferring from one axle back to the other, and that's where you get that chucking and the rough ride from. In addition to switching over to a slipper style, where if you hit a bump with the first axle, it hits the bump and stops, and the second axle hits a bump and stops. And what's going to help it come to a stop without that equalizer is going to be the 4 shocks that we have on here. Now, if you're somewhat satisfied with the ride of your vehicle and you just want a little bit more control of it, you feel like it keeps bouncing back and forth, what you can do is you can just add the shocks to your existing system. If you like the way that feels, then you can head down the road with it. If you don't like it, then you can decide and add this slipper style system later on. You cannot just add the slipper system, but you can use the shocks by themselves. Now that we've shown you the system in a little bit more detail, let's go ahead and show you how to get it installed. To begin our installation, what I recommend doing if you have tire sensors on here is draw an F on, or write an F on your front tire and an R on your rear tire. That way you don't have to reset up your tire sensors when you take your wheels and tires off. So we're using a 22 millimeter socket to remove our lug nuts because we got to take both of these off. Now what we need to do is you're going to need to get a couple of jack stands to put underneath your axles to support them. We've got these adjustable ones. They work super well because we can lift them up and lower them down later when we go to line the springs up with the holes in our hangers. It makes it super easy. If you don't have those, you can use a standard stationary jack stand with just a floor jack. Set the axle on top of the jack stand. Just take the weight off the axle so that when we remove these the hangers from all of the tops of the axles and the springs, that your axles don't fall to the ground. Then for us, we're going to need a 22 millimeter socket in order to take the U-bolts off of our axles. When you look at the top of the U-bolt before you take it off, make sure you've got like at least a 1/2 inch here, if not a little bit more. We've got maybe 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch. If you have your U-bolt more flush with the top of the nut, you're going to want to pick up some longer U-bolts to accept the plate that Roadmaster gives you to put on the underside of this, but on top of the springs. Now we're just going to take our U-bolts and tap them out. Then you'll take an 11/16 socket and a 13/16 wrench, and we can take these hanger bolts out. There will be 3 of them, 1 on each of the hangers, and this should drop down your entire leaf spring assembly. So on this last one, something I wanted to point out, a lot of these factory campers, like we talked about a little bit earlier, they ride so rough that they end up just damaging the components on the trailer. So they actually had to have a new hanger welded on the back here because the other one ripped off. That comfort ride system that we're putting on here should help a lot with that, with making the travel of this camper a lot smoother. Now we're going to need to knock these bolts out. And usually you'll have to use a hammer to knock them out because we have these splines here. This is also a good example of why you can never reuse these bolts, because the splines, once they've dug in once, they don't like to dig in again. So you'll have to, your kit should come with some, but I highly recommend switching over to wet bolts to replace them when we put the new system back on. I like to do the center bolt that's holding the equalizer last, because then what you can do is you take your leaf spring, you can rotate it down here. Set that one on the ground. You take this one, lift up a little bit, rotate it down, and then this whole assembly comes out. You may have seen other videos or reading other directions or something that tells you to take all of this apart. There's no need to do that. It's just 4 other bolts that is unnecessary to remove. So we've got this whole assembly out. We can set that to the side and start assembling our new one. This centerpiece here is what we're going to need next. This is what replaces your equalizer in the center. What I highly recommend is you're going to need to take some measurements to see if this kit's going to fit on your camper, and that is to measure this opening, which is 6.5 inches, and you want to measure from where the gusset, if you have gussets, are welded to the bottom of our frame rail here, to the bottom of the frame rail over here. Measure that distance. If it is wider than 6.5 inches, then this kit's not going to work for your camper, because this big centerpiece has to sit flat up against the bottom of your frame. And we've had cases before where these gussets were much wider. But the other thing that Roadmaster did to help with this is they made this opening bigger. The opening used to be literally the same size as those hangers, so it fit up there nice and perfect, but any camper that had gussets, it wouldn't fit on. So they made this bigger and hope to make it fit more campers. Just a little note that you want to take before proceeding any further. But what we need to do now is I'm just going to lift this up, loosely hold it up in place, and I'm going to mark on the frame rail right here and right here, and I need to clean off the bottom so that it is sitting flat up against metal. So any of this stuff here, if you have self-tapping screws or this plastic corrugation, we're going to cut all that stuff off. Now we can lift the centerpiece up into place, grab one of your bigger bolts and a washer. I guess the washer is really not necessary right now. We're just going to use this to mark our holes that we're going to have to drill into the bottom of our frame rail. So make sure it's nice and square. Do not trust the squareness of this hanger, because it's very likely that it is not straight. So what we're going to do is just look down our frame rail. Make sure we have the same distance hanging off the edge here as we do here. Then what we're going to do is take a marker. We're going to trace out these holes. And then we can remove this bracket and drill our holes for our self-tappers. Now what we can do is we're going to take a small pilot drill bit, drill a hole up through the center of those marks we just made, and work our way up to 21/64. That specific drill bit size works really, really good for these self-tappers that we're going to end up putting in to bite in real well, but not have to work too hard to cut any more material. Now grab your big self-tapping screws and a 14mm socket, and we're going to run these up inside these holes. And we'll take our center bracket, we're going to hold it up in place. Again, take that big bolt with the flat washer on it. I'm just going to barely push it through the hole, because we need to take this spacer and slide it up in between here. And this is going to help prevent the hanger from collapsing when we tighten this assembly down. And on the other side, we'll follow it with another flat washer and a nylon lock nut. Then we'll take our self-tappers and put them back up into place. To get our slipper springs assembled, we'll start with this block that has a space in the bottom here. The slipper springs, actually, the top of it is going to ride on the bottom of this bracket in between these 2 points. We're going to slide this in. You'll have this larger hole here. Just line it up, slide the bolt through, and on the back side, put your nylon lock nut. And this is going to be the same size bolt as this one we used for the center. Then we'll take our leaf spring. We're going to rotate it down and into place. Line up the rear hole here. This is the wet bolt I was talking about that I would highly recommend replacing the factory bolts with. Take it, slide it through our leaf spring. Once you get to this point, I'm just taking that impact, that 14mm socket we just used earlier. You'll see the new splines we have on here, and we'll take it, you take the 3/8 side and slide it over top of the grease zerk, and we're gonna have to beat this in until those teeth bite into that opening. Another thing you can do if you don't want to use the socket technique is you can take the grease zerk out with an 8mm wrench. You just want to be sure that whenever you're hitting the head of this bolt, then you're being very, very diligent about hitting it square so you don't damage the threads or the area around the opening. Now we're going to take some red Loctite, we'll put it on the inside of our nut that goes on our wet bolt. And notice it's got these little notches on it, and then there's a side without notches. Put the notches, you'll want to put the non-notch side on the bolt first. And then we're just going to want to snug these up. You don't want to tighten them down too far because the leaf spring still has to be able to pivot inside this bracket. Now we're going to lift up on our leaf spring pack. We're going to slide this spacer in here. We may have to end up bending this bracket out a little bit. I like to try to just pull it out by hand first. It looks like it's going to be a little too tight to fit that spacer up in there. So we'll grab a pry bar and just open this up a little bit so I can fit the spacer in. Grab one of your smaller bolts. We'll slide it through that pipe spacer, through to the other side, and follow it up with a nylon lock nut. Now we're going to use our jacks to lift our axle up into place. You want to make sure that the bolt on the bottom of this pin here is sitting on the hole that's in the top of the leaf spring perch. And we'll slide this on top of the pin. Then we can take I like to put the U-bolts on next. It's a little bit easier to just go through one plate than it is two. So put your U-bolt up in place. Make sure you're not hitting any wiring or anything. And then take your top plate, drop that down, and then we'll follow it up with our nuts. Now we're going to take our 7/8 socket and we're going to tighten all of these nuts down on our U-bolts to the specifications per the axle or the U-bolt itself. Ours are 9/16 U-bolts, so we're just using that specification on the back of our instructions, and they are for Dexter axles, so that kind of helps a little bit. Just measure your U-bolt and then torque them down. You want to make sure that you're doing these evenly. What I typically like to do is count to 3 or 4 quarter turns or half turns, whatever you're doing, and then move on to the other side or to the other U-bolt, and that'll ensure you've got even tightness. The other thing you can do is look at the tops of the U-bolts sticking out, and you want them all to be as even as you can. Once you get your U-bolts torqued down, you want to torque down the 5 bolts that are on this centerpiece. Once you get all that done, that's going to do it for the one side. You want to repeat that same process on the other side of your camper. Now on the inside, underneath our trailer, we got it lifted up in the air so it's a lot easier for you guys to see. We're going to take the shorter hex bolts that come with these brackets. They're going to be separate from the rest of the hardware that came with the leaf springs and stuff. So we'll take those 2 bolts, put them on, then we'll take our nylock nuts and put them on the back side. Then we'll take a 19mm socket and wrench and tighten these down. Now we're going to take one of our longer bolts and one of our shocks, and then this is up to you whether or not you want the sticker facing the outside or the inside. I like it to face the outside, so that way you can see it, whether it's working properly, if you're going over some small bumps at a low speed. But so we'll hold it like this, take this bolt, slide it on with a flat washer. Then we're going to take another flat washer, slide it on, and a spacer. And then we'll take one of these wedges. You're going to need one of these wedges on the inside and on the outside. So we've got the inside one here, and then we're going to lift this up into place, put it in through the hole, and then we'll put some more hardware on the inside. Now we're going to lift this up into place. We're going to put it through this hole right here in our main piece in the middle. And then we'll take another one of those blocks, put it on the inside. So put that wedge on, then put the flat washer on, and then follow it with a nut. Those wedges, you'll see here in a little bit, but those wedges are designed to make up for the angle that the shock is going to be at, because it's going to be kind of cocked at an angle like this. So those wedges are designed to make it so that these spacer blocks are going to still mount flat up against those. Now what I like to do is take this bolt, we're just going to slide it in here for now. We're not going to put any washers or anything on it. Then I'm going to take a piece of tape, and you'll notice how this block up here is just going to want to swivel to where the thicker portion is on the bottom. We need to angle that thick portion to where it's pointed down towards this lower mounting point. And then I'm just going to tape it to the side so that it stays there, so that we have the correct angle for where our shock mounts to the side there. The inside one is going to be the opposite. So we've got this one at, say, the about 7 o'clock hour. The one on the inside needs to be more like at the 11 o'clock hour. So we're just going to take that and we'll tape that one off too. Once you get both of them taped off, we're just going to take that same 19mm wrench and socket and snug these down. With that secured, we can pop those two pieces of tape off. We pop that lower bolt out. We're going to put a flat washer on. That's going to pop through here. Then we'll put a spacer block on, another flat washer, and then the shock, which we'll just pull out a little bit. You may have to push it inside just to flex a little bit to get it to line up. We'll put another flat washer and then our lock nut. And then we'll snug it down. Once we've got this one done and all secured, we'll take the strap, cut it off, remove it, and we'll repeat that same process on the remaining three. Then we'll grab a torque wrench and torque all of this hardware to the specifications in the instructions. Now the last thing we need to do is take a grease gun, pop it onto our grease zerk, and shoot some grease into these fittings. Now all that's left to do is to put your wheels and tires back on, make sure you torque those lug nuts, and that's going to do it for the installation. Hopefully this video helped you decide whether or not the Roadmaster Comfort Ride Slipper Spring System is right for you in your 2023 Grand Design Solitude.